here. Mia O'Brien, Hays Carlyon, sitting in for the vacation and Gus Logue. Welcome into Duval Rundown, episode 107 on this fine Monday, April 14th. Of course, you get me every day, Helmets and Heels, 12 to 2 p.m. on the Superstation. You get Hays every day, Frangie Show, 4 to 6 p.m. You also get the two of us during Jaguars football season on Sundays as part of the kickoff show. But here we are on a Monday edition of Duval Rundown. It's been a long time coming, Carlyon. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with this. We're branding this episode, this little crossover episode, if you may, Hays, as this is the emptying the notebook episode. We will use the canvas of my mock draft 3.0, which will go live here in about an hour on 1010XL.com and the 1010XL social channels. But we're diving into all of it. Storylines, rumors, what we're hearing, things we want to dispel. And so while we'll go through the mock draft and maybe use that as kind of a template, I want to get your big picture, what you're hearing, what you are feeling in your heart of hearts right now when it comes to that first round pick for the Jacksonville Jaguars. In an ideal world, James Gladstone, Liam Cohen would select or do this with the 5th overall pick.
I think the interesting thing for me is how they assess the value in this draft and where to attack positions of weakness and positions of strength. Obviously, Mason Graham makes the most sense in terms of guys that we think will be there and the need involved in that. But I keep getting back to offensive tackle just because if you don't address it at 5, I'm not sure you get a great opportunity to address it at any other point in the draft. To me, there's just such a drop-off between Campbell and M'Boue to the rest of the class. And again, I keep hearing, watching The Hunt and hearing Tony Boselli saying, we're starting at ground zero. It does make me wonder if Boselli, Cohen, and Gladstone have sort of come around on the idea of we can't fix everything in one offseason, but we can absolutely fix the offensive line. And I'm not sure that even though they have really prioritized it in free agency, I'm not sure they wouldn't take one of those 2 tackles at 5, potentially. So to me, it's a big guy. Mason Graham makes a ton of sense. He's probably considered consensusly a better prospect than Campbell or M'Boue, although it's close. But I think it's a big guy. I think if you take the offensive tackle at 5, then everything else, as you go down the board, everything else is still really in play with great value. If you don't take it at 5, then I think you're saying to yourself, are you only drafting a guard? And if that's the case, then that's fine. You're in good position. I just can't get over. I don't think this administration is going to allow Trent Baalke to decide who the week 1 left tackle is. And I don't think they're going to let a Walker Little extension just cement the fact that he's the starting left tackle. So, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think in terms of striking the board at the right spot, I think you almost have to go offensive tackle at 5 if that's a position that you're looking to upgrade. And my guess is they are.
And of course, we're coming at you live right now on YouTube and Twitter. This entire podcast will be available on demand at the 1010XL Podcast Network and the 1010XL Jaguars YouTube channel. Brian brings up a great point in the YouTube chat. There are good defensive tackles later in the draft, and I have on good authority from a couple different folks that the Jaguars know that. They are very aware that you can find great value at defensive tackle later in this year's class. But ultimately, when I asked James Gladstone that final question, Hays, during his availability after free agency's first 2 days, and I asked him about the edge depth in the building already, the defensive tackle depth in the building already, and evaluating that in contrast to what was available in the NFL draft. And he said, we want these rookies to get out on the grass, rookies plural. We want them to be out there immediately. And if we had signed Band-Aid free agent fixes, then that is a block way to them getting on the field. And that is where I look at the Jaguars' current offensive line. if they are only Band-Aid free agent fixes, there are blocks in place that would prevent a rookie offensive lineman drafted high from starting right away. So either you're looking to trade a Walker Little and Ezra Cleveland. You just signed your center and your right guard by all accounts, even if your right guard also gives you tackle versatility. And so that's where, knowing what the Jaguars did in free agency, it just seems like they're going to double dip along the defensive line for certain. And it feels like all signs point to me as it will be Mason Graham at number 5 overall. Let me throw, just because, and we love you guys to keep commenting, keep interacting on the YouTube and the X feed right now. Just because it has been a talking point. Ashton Genty, Tyler Warren, Tet McMillan out of Arizona. I heard from a league source earlier this week that Tyler Warren's representation is all but hinting that they have a top 10 guarantee given to them. They are not interviewing with teams outside of the top 10. This person was like, oh, it's got to be Jacksonville or the Jets. I don't believe that to be true from other conversations I've had with people here in Jacksonville. But what do you make of some of those skill players, and if the Jaguars could go that direction with that 5th overall pick?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, James Gladstone talked, I believe, at the Combine about we're going to prioritize, big guys and guys that can score touchdowns. Well, certainly Genty, Warren, Tet, those guys would all fit that description in terms of putting points on the board. So I don't think it's not where I think they'll go, because I do think there'll be an attractive big guy at 5, whether it's on the defensive or offensive side of the ball. But yeah, I mean, it's something that, you have to consider, because again, you look offensively, other than Brian Thomas Jr., what do they have that I think would really scare opponents? I know they like De'Ami Brown. We'll see. And the running backs have been, kind of hit or miss in terms of Etienne and Bigsby. And Brenton Strange, you don't really know, you have an idea what you have, but you've never seen him in the expanded role that it appears he's going to have. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's on the table. I keep going back to, I think you just have to focus on what positions can we wait on and what positions can we not wait on. And when you're at 5, you can play that game a little bit better. If they were in the teens or the 20s, it'd be harder to do that. But when you're at 5, you can really set the tone for the draft. And I just think to take, Ashton Genty at 5 when there's so many other backs available, to take Warren at 5 when tight end's pretty deep, and and even McMillan, which would be enticing to pair him with Brian Thomas Jr. I think you can help yourself at receiver later on. So, again, I go back to just, I think they're going to build it with, in this first off season, let's get the foundation set in the trenches as best we can. But yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. I mean, in terms of ranking Genty, Warren, Tetero, how do you kind of see that if they want to go with somebody that can, get them in the end zone?
Yeah, so we are doing this episode with Mia's Mock Draft Mondays as kind of the backdrop. And so last week I wrote, and this was after the owners' meetings, Hays, and after Liam Cohen referred to the wing tee and using it as an inspiration, as something that he draws from twice between the Hunt episode and then also what he had to say at the owners' meetings down in West Palm. And so the logical, of course, connection was, oh, okay, well, whether it's Warren or Ashton Genty, maybe this is pointing at, at that potential selection. But I agree with you. There's great depth, not only at running back, but at tight end in this year's class. The wide receiver position, and this is where we promised you guys, some scoops, some intel. The wide receiver position for me is one that the Jaguars, I think, even more than defensive tackle, because they did not pick anyone up in free agency. The wide receiver position is the one that they've backed themselves into a corner, and they realize they need to hit on someone opposite Brian Thomas Jr. because De'Ami Brown is only on a 1-year deal, because his strength is on the outside as a burner, and you still need someone, because you don't know what Gabe Davis is at this point, that will complement BTJ. And while Parker Washington is a more than capable slot receiver, he is a slot receiver in the old mold of he is an undersized, thick guy. That is not what the Sean McVay tree wide receiver looks like. As much as I believe in Parker, because I've had multiple conversations with him about him flexing outside, I know that this is a front office that is looking for a certain type of player. The good news is that there are several of them. One of them may have made an appearance in Mia's Mock Draft 1.0 and TCU's Jack Betch. The other may or may not be making an appearance next week because I got some intel that the Jaguars, there's a certain Ohio State receiver that if he was there at 36, James Gladstone would literally moonwalk and do the worm to get to the podium. So point being, I think that the Jaguars have this really nice sweet spot for wide receiver at 36, because as much as, and again, we're giving away my mock draft 3.0, which is going to drop at 10 a.m. here today. Look, in this week's mock draft, I have Jaden Higgins falling to 70. Every scout, every executive, every coach that I polled around the league said he's not going to be there. Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks said last week on the Move the Sticks podcast, they think he's gone before the middle of the second round. And so that is where, if you've kind of given yourself this runway of Higgins, Besh, Emeka Ibuka, because they're all in that Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua mold. And while certainly there's value later on, I see Social brought up Jalen Royals, who certainly a conversation can be had about the Utah State receiver. I've brought up Isaac Tesla out of Arkansas, who tested off the charts in the pre-draft process. Nick Nash out of San Jose State, I know has been a Duval Rundown fan favorite. Point being, I think if you've put yourself in a corner where you need to come away with a number 2 wide receiver, to your point, Hays, well, now you have to take wide receiver at 36 or 70, unless you're able to trade back and maybe acquire more capital, coupled with you have to take a defensive tackle at some point. The depth is certainly there, but are you also having to invest in the offensive line? And so if you're pushing yourself into a corner and pigeonholing yourself that you have to come away from the end of Friday of the draft with X, Y, and Z, that's where the puzzle piece making is going to get a little tricky, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. In terms of, so let's get to your mock draft. Mm-hmm. So give me who were off the board, who were the first 4 picks, and then how did it go in terms of who you decided to take at 5?
Yep. So this week, and I put a little asterisk because I wrote this mock draft midweek last week, Hays. I actually had finalized most of it. I did finish the last few picks on Saturday, but most of it was done Friday at 4:30 p.m. when I was getting ready to leave the office. And then the Derek Carr news came out of New Orleans, because already in this week's mock draft, I had the Saints coming up to 5 because they got wind that the Raiders were going to select a quarterback. And I believed that quarterback would be Shedeur Sanders, who ironically today will be visiting with the Las Vegas Raiders here on this Monday, April 14th. Now, what is of note is that Kellen Moore, the head coach of the Saints, was the only NFL head coach at Ole Miss Pro Day. His offense coordinator, Doug Nussmeier, his quarterbacks coach, Scott Tolzien, they were all at Jackson Dart's Pro Day, but they weren't at Shedeur Sanders' Pro Day. And so that's where, I do want to give that disclaimer of like how I structured this potential trade. I think the Saints are 1,000% in the quarterback market, even prior to the Derek Carr injury that now could require surgery. But certainly that only enhances the argument of what I'd already written last week. Yeah. And so I have the Jaguars trading back to 9, which I think would be, for them, they would throw a party for that as well, because look, acquiring more darts to throw at the proverbial dartboard is huge. In this scenario, they would pick up, obviously, the 9th overall pick. They would pick up a 3rd rounder and then a 2026 3rd rounder. And with that 9th overall pick, they select Jalen Walker, edge, Georgia. And so we'll get to Jalen here in a second, because I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that one. To give you the rest of my day 1, day 2 picks, I have the Jaguars trading back in the 2nd as well, again, acquiring even more draft capital, even more dart throws. And I have them selecting Jonah Savanaia, offensive lineman, Arizona, has starts at tackle and guard during his collegiate career, 21 years old, a captain at Arizona during his final season there, would potentially be a plug-and-play starter at guard, but does have that tackle versatility. 3 third-round picks now on the board. And with the 3 third-round picks, again, Jaden Higgins somehow there at 70, so they run to the podium. Shamar Turner somehow there, the defensive tackle out of Texas A&M. They sprint to the podium at 71 as well. RJ Harvey, running back UCF, their final third round selection, rounding out day 2 of this week's mock draft.
Yeah, I mean, that would be an ideal scenario if they're able to move back a couple of times. And I like the New Orleans partnership there, because the Saints have to, I mean, they have to address it. Even if Carr was okay, it would be a need. But now, in particular, and so that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's good value. I think the Jaguars could even possibly get New Orleans' second round pick. Now, they probably wouldn't get anything in 2026. So I think there's a lot of good options there in terms of making a deal. So if moving back from 5, who was the most enticing player that was on the board at 5 that if you had to have stuck, you would have taken?
Yeah. So Mason Graham was on the board in that scenario. And so that's again where, you have this question because the Patriots went offensive line with Will Campbell.
Patriots took Campbell at 4.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so, right. And so that's where
I think that makes a lot of sense. If they can trade back, I think that's the top priority, as it should be. And look, I mean, Jalen Walker would be really exciting. We've lamented for 2 years the lack of an edge presence beyond Hines Allen and Trayvon Walker. And so, I think it would certainly make a lot of sense, particularly if the new administration wants to see more of Trayvon Walker inside on obvious passing situations. So I mean, you love everything about Jalen Walker in terms of what you hear about him as a person. And I do think it's a big need. So, to increase that pass rush potential, I think makes a ton of sense. And I mean, there is depth at edge, but if you've traded back to 9 and acquired some more draft ammunition, and again, I would assume at that point, we know Campbell's gone. Membu's probably off the board as well, I would assume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So at that point, I would think they're probably okay with Walker Little and Anton Harrison. I like the selection of a natural guard to supplant Ezra Cleveland. And so I think that would make a lot of sense. And again, it highlights, I think they're in a good position. I don't buy into the, they're a team without a country with the 5th pick. I don't, there's never been a draft ever in the history of this league where at the 5th pick in the draft, you were basically out of any good options. So I don't buy into that. I think if they have to stay at 5 and select, I think they're in a good position. But I do think in New Orleans, I think it's at the top of the list. I do think there'll be quarterback needy teams that should be willing to make a deal. Let me ask you this. If Pittsburgh, let's say the Saints don't call, but Pittsburgh calls, is 21 too far down for you, or would you be willing to go from 5 to 21?
If Gray Zabel's there at 21, which I mean, obviously that's a lot of speculation because then we're talking, you're having to wait that game out. I actually have the draft trade value chart pulled up right now, Hays. So let me see how many points that would require for Pittsburgh to move up. So 1,700 to, I will tell you, oh, wow. So that would be almost an 1,100 point value. So we're talking multiple future picks because the Steelers have a first round pick.
Yeah, let's say you get their 26 first rounder and you get their second rounder this year. And obviously 21.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's massive value that, I mean, hey, if they do it, if they're that sold on Shador or Jackson Dart, I think you would do it if you're Gladstone, because ultimately this is a draft class that arguably has somewhere between 10 to 12 blue chip talent players, blue dot players, if you may, in the scouting world. And then it has a lot of solid starters. And Daniel Jeremiah said this last week, and it's so true, because not only did James Gladstone say it about free agency, but now you could say it about this draft class too. You have a great opportunity to raise the floor and elevate the middle third of your roster. And while, yes, maybe you're not bringing in these foundational pieces that are going to transform your franchise outside of Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter, that player doesn't exist in this class. Yes, Mason Graham and Will Campbell and Armand Membu are steady players. Jalen Walker, as I wrote in this week's mock draft, I had someone tell me at the combine that if you were just drafting dudes who could like run your franchise, be that leader in the locker room and be that alpha. Jalen Walker's that guy. He should run for president of the United States, I was told by somebody else. And I was also told by some folks in Athens, because I did reach out to some of the folks up there, shout out to Georgia. And I said, look, what do you make of him? Because every scout and executive I talked to this week said he is going to be an edge because that is where the value is, especially with a first round pick. But ultimately, the team that drafts him has to make a decision. And they also have to make a decision on what the process is going to be to teach him how to play. Is he just going to line up at wide 9 on third down and you're going to say to him, go get the quarterback, but then he lines off at off-ball linebacker? Well, if that's the case, and Gus Logue made this point before he headed out on vacation. Yes, in case you're just joining us and disappointed, no Gus. Gus is on a well-deserved vacation, so Hays and I are filling in. But Gus made the point last week. He said, okay, well, Olufemi Oladejo, who's another favorite of mine, who I think fits the intangibly mold definition from UCLA, the former off-ball linebacker converted edge, you could get him at 70 or 88. So why are you taking Jalen Walker at 9? And that's where, to your point about would you go back to 21? Well, if Jalen Walker at 9 is in the same boat as a player at 21, like a Gray Zabel, who would have to learn a new position, but still affect your football team and affect your locker room in a positive way, and they're all in that same bunch, then I don't care, because guess what? If you are acquiring capital for next year's draft, when there is more blue dot talent, then sign me up for that. And maybe that's what James Gladstone means when he says that we want more dart throws, not just this year, but you've heard him, Hays. How many times has he said, we have the most draft capital the next 2 years? This is not a just solely focus on 2025 right now when it comes to drafting.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is interesting, in terms about the tangibly rich and putting such an emphasis on that, are you surprised they're not doing in-person visits? That strikes me as, and I get the Rams and there's the whole offseason's been a love letter to the Rams, and so everything's going to be done the way the Rams did it. But it seems like it's a little risky in that, I mean, yes, you have area scouts that can talk to you about, the character of these players, and maybe they feel like it's a little canned when a player visits in person. But I find that very unusual that they don't want to have anything to do with bringing prospects in, even if it's just, bring a group of them in the same day. I'm curious to see if it works, but for looking at it, prioritizing character and as much as they are, or at least appear to be, I was a little surprised that, of the new methodology of not wanting to have a guy in your facility for at least a few hours and just get some sense of him as a person and a player before you invest such a big chunk of your ammunition into that player. I mean, and to me, you have so many of these that I don't think you're necessarily tipping off the other teams by where you're going to go. I thought it was interesting that they're skipping basically what I think is a fairly critical piece of the evaluation process, which is just like getting to kind of interact with the person for a 2 or 3 hours in your building.
I'm smiling because the comments on YouTube right now, I don't know if James Gladstone and the Rams love letter has already brainwashed our Duval Rundown audience, or if it's me and Gus Logue and me preaching the good word of Jordan Rodrigue, our friend over at The Athletic. We got Hef. You learn more about players when they don't expect them to be around. Social, they're prepped for those visits. Yes, because that is the sentiment that the Rams camp has tried to convey about why they don't do top 30 visits. They believe there's more value in going to the prospect in their natural habitat and seeing how they interact in that ecosystem. And then they can say, all right, as opposed to bringing them into a sterile environment where they're prepared, they know they have to impress. We're just going to observe them and talk to everyone around them. And this is the part, Hays, that I don't have an answer to, and I doubt James Gladstone will give it to us tomorrow during the pre-draft luncheon availability. The Los Angeles Rams have the veteran Andy Sugarman, who's in his 15th season as a special assistant to GM Les Snead. And what Andy does is he gets a one-way ticket in March. And the final 20 or so guys that Les Snead says, these are our dudes. Go out. You're on a mission. And he just books one-way tickets and goes across the country, just zigzagging across the country, and schedules individual one-on-one time with those prospects that the Rams have earmarked. And that included last year having lunch with Jared Verse 2 days prior to the NFL draft. What's interesting, and it wasn't specifically stated where, but he went to Tallahassee. He saw Jared Verse with everybody at Florida State, yes. But then they scheduled a meeting, and I'm pretty sure it must have been in Lake City because they said it was an hour outside of Tallahassee, kind of remote where no one could find them. They tried to do something similar last year with Chop Robinson. The media found out about the visit. It got out. The Rams were not too happy. I don't know who the Andy Sugarman is for James Gladstone here in Jacksonville. I don't know if he has one yet. I don't know if he's going to try to have one. Because if he does, all right, cool. But if he doesn't, because this is a staff he inherited from Trent Baalke, I think that's also where he deserves a lot of grace, because maybe that is the ultimate play. And right now, you're just starting to put in an infrastructure that doesn't have all the pieces yet.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you give these guys the benefit of the doubt, until you see warning signs that they're making poor decisions. But it just, again, it might be where the league is headed. We might look up in 5 years and these visits, pretty much no one does them. I just think it's for where the Jaguars are in their build. If the Rams want to do it that way, okay, I think they've earned that. This is a new administration, and it seems like you're giving up an informational piece by not doing it. Now, if they're behind and, maybe because of, the change and having a new GM and new coach and new EVP, I mean, if the logic was, well, we really needed to get more into the film with prospects and things like that and our needs and what our priorities are, and we didn't want to be weighed down and lose a week by having, let's say they didn't even use all 30. Let's just say they used 23, welcoming in 23 prospects. Well, yeah, I would imagine that would take up, a big part of your week. It's not necessarily something that I think is a mistake. It's just a little bit of a surprise. I get the Rams don't do it, but the Rams are very much set up. They've got their culture. They've established a championship program. And so, I think with the Jaguars and everything being new, I just think it's interesting. We'll see. I mean, they may have a spectacular draft with no character issues and hopefully that's the way it goes. I just think you're opening yourself up if you draft somebody in the first, second round and they end up being a total flake.
Mm-hmm. I totally get that. For time's sake, I want to run through a couple of my other picks in this week's mock draft just to get your take philosophically, Hays, on positional value as well as maybe some of these names if they jump out to you. And so again, after acquiring a ton of capital between trade backs in the first and second round in this week's mock draft, I do have the Jaguars still owning pick 107. They select Logan Brown, offensive tackle out of Kansas, developmental for now, but his raw athletic score, top 100 all time for a tackle. Round 4, pick 122, Jamari Caldwell, defensive tackle out of Oregon, one of Gus Logue's guys. He would be your heir apparent to Devon Hamilton. I want to put an asterisk on that and circle back to that with you here in just a second, Hays. Rounding out the 4th round picks, the Jaguars would have gotten a third one there during all those trade backs. They would select Dorian Strong, outside corner, Virginia Tech, 6'1", 185 pounds. As I wrote this week, he wins the award for Dave Campo's I Love a Long Corner award this week. Round 5. This is an interesting one for me. I was told by a couple scouts, a couple executives, they don't expect him to be here, even though he's a draft and stash candidate. Riley Mills, defensive tackle out of Notre Dame. I just feel like he really fits that intangibly rich ideals that James Gladstone has talked about. 61 career games at Notre Dame. The undisputed leader took an RV to the Orange Bowl because he could not play and could not fly after tearing his ACL. So he and his parents literally rented an RV and drove themselves to South Florida from Indiana, which that kind of says it all. Two 6th round picks, Mac McWilliams, corner out of UCF. Tight end Luke Lachey out of Iowa. If you would like to read my love letter and my own scouting eval that I've been concocting for 2.5 years for this prospect, enjoy my tangent because it is one of the greatest rants I think I've gone on in the 5-year history of Mia's mock draft. And then finally with their 7th round pick, and I know a lot of the scouts I spoke with really liked this one, and I think it's a reality, Kareem Reed, a linebacker out of Utah. And so just to summarize and to recap, that would be Jalen Walker, an edge with the 1st round pick, Jonah Savanaia, offensive lineman with the 2nd round pick, a wide receiver, a defensive tackle, running back with 3rd round picks, tackle on offense, tackle on defense, 2 corners, a draft and stash defensive tackle, a tight end, and a linebacker on day 3.
Love it. Sign me up.
Any of those names jump out at you, Hays, or any of the positional value that you say, hey, maybe this is a position the Jaguars aren't talking about, but I do think they need to address?
No, I think you've hit the points of emphasis. And, again, in trading back, if they're able to do that, I think it'll be hard to walk away from this draft not feeling like they've hit a home run, and adding that kind of value. So, no, I mean, I think if they're able to add receiver, corner, obviously edge, a natural guard, I think they would feel great about that. So, well done. We'll see if Gladstone can be as good at this as you are.
Hey, listen, we can only hope and pray. I did want to note this one from Dell, who I know joined us a little bit late, Hays. He gets the vibe that if James Gladstone is able to trade down, could it be for future picks as opposed to other picks in this year's draft? That certainly has been a way that Trent Baalke did set the Jaguars up for success, trading back for Brian Thomas Jr. in the 1st round last year to acquire a 3rd and a 4th round pick this year. Could a similar move be made? I promised I put an asterisk on it, so let's circle back and end with this. Devon Hamilton, just looking at the contract, looking at Spot Track over the weekend, the Jaguars probably could get away if they were to move on and designate him as a post-June 1 release. Again, we don't know what type of defensive scheme Anthony Campanella is planning on running. We don't know how many defensive tackles, when James Gladstone says rookies, plural, along the defensive line they're looking to acquire. I do know this. They want guys. I don't want to use the word mean. So what I will instead frame the conversation is as this, Hays. For the last 5-6 years, since the last year of the Dave Caldwell, Doug Marrone administration, there's been this knock that the Jaguars have drafted Eagle Scouts. That's not the reality. The Jaguars have drafted great, upstanding citizens and good dudes. Eagle Scouts, I'm a Gold Award Girl Scout, so I can say this on the female counterpart side. Eagle Scouts are maniacal, competitive, crazy MFers because they will do any and everything to get the project, the assignment completed. It's that intangibly rich, and maybe that means that they come off a little bit mean, a little bit more rugged. And I do think that that is the identity that this team is trying to build. And I'm not sure that everybody who's currently in the building fits that mold, and especially that defensive line, because to bring it full circle, as you said, the trenches are going to be the priority in this year's draft.
Yeah, I mean, I think outside of about 6 or 7 players on this roster, I think if you're a returning player, you should be nervous. And so, yeah, I think Devon Hamilton is absolutely. I think there's a chance that he won't be here. It depends on what they end up doing in the draft, but yeah, I mean, I don't think it's set in stone for a guy like Devon Hamilton, Ezra Cleveland. I think they are looking at it when the EVP says you're at ground zero. I would think any big man who is not either Josh Hines-Allen, Trayvon Walker, or one of these free agents they just brought in, I think you should be nervous about your spot. I mean, I think Anton Harrison is probably okay, but yeah, I think Walker Little, Devon Hamilton. I mean, to me, there's a trio of established starters in the trenches that I think absolutely their fate is still a little bit cloudy in terms of will they be here week 1.
We got to get out of here. I know Robert's out here looking for Hays to comment on the Walker Little situation. I know I've heard maybe, bigger year for Anton Harrison than some believe. That will be a conversation for another time. Be sure to follow us on 1010XL Jaguars, all the 1010XL social channels. Hays, thanks so much for stopping by. And hey, I'm going to be here all week on Duval Rundown. So if y'all want to keep dropping some scoops, come on in, sign up, subscribe. Leave a comment, leave a chat, and we'll keep the party going. Frank Frangie going to join me tomorrow as well. You know that he's ready. He's chomping at the bit, Carlyon, to get on Duval Rundown for the first time in a couple of weeks. And I appreciate you hopping on, especially because you were just in Las Vegas just about, 48 hours ago?
Yeah, no problem at all. Great to be with you. Happy to do it.
Awesome. Thanks for hopping on, everybody. 600 plus of you live right now on X and YouTube. We will catch you tomorrow at 9:04.